Hello, everyone.
Where am I?
Oh, Eric, yeah, no.
Okay, people are coming in. We're going to give people a chance to come in.
Rabbi, my name is Ben Sion Friedman. I'm a member of Congregation Road of Shalom on North Broad Street. And I just made a little, I think it's a cute observation during the Hakafot, during Rosh Hashanah. I said, it's the Jewish version of the Bummers Parade because we were marching around on North Broad Street. So maybe it's not funny, but it seemed funny at the time.
Sorry, I lost you. It cut out. I didn't hear.
Oh, during the I belong to the Congregation Road of Shalom, which is on North Broad Street, Broad Mount Vernon. And during the Hakafot, Rosh Hashanah, I made a joke that it's the Jewish version of the Mummers Parade. That's all. It seemed funny at the time. Thank you. Thank you for laughing.
Cute, cute. People are still coming in. We're going to give people a chance. Oh, here come more. We're going to give people a chance to come in. We'll do 2 more minutes and then we'll get moving. I'm going to grab everything. Just a second.
Leonard, I know you're in charge. I see a rabbi is in the Sukkah out of Israel, and the Sukkah at Rosh Shalom, of course, is also very nice. I'm sure they're all nice.
Yeah, and your friends at Rosh Shalom are always welcome to our Lunch and Learn. It's open to everybody. So glad you're with us.
I've been going for a while. It's very worthwhile. Thank you.
And glad everyone else is with us as we wait. And welcome back, Karen. It's good to see you. Great to see you.
Nice to see you.
A reminder to everyone that if there are others that should be added to our list, to let me know so we can keep folks informed. And also thank you for joining today, even though we had a little bit of a short notice about the topic because of the holidays. But
take care with your family.
It is a virtual trip to the Sukkah, thanks to Rabbi Eric. I guess Rabbi Eric will talk about logistics at the end and maybe talk substance now, but it's your show, and thank you as always for doing this.
Happily, and glad everyone's here. I will show you just a quick tour of the Sukkah. There you go. That's the quick tour of the Sukkah. You will notice I'm going to show you the decoration disparity, and I'm going to explain it to you in just a moment. So when we had our Sukkah decorating party, people are still coming in. When we had our Sukkah decorating party, over in this corner here, where you'll see if I point up, the decorations are somewhat sparse. We had the Eagles game on. Over here were the people who were decorating, and in eye line of the Eagles game, you can see there are plenty of decorations. So you can just see, where people were focused. You had a bunch of people standing right where I am right now that really did not make a single paper chain, let's be honest. And but paced with me the entire time. We also, just outside the sukkah right here, had minyan. And I might admit that when the Eagles scored, we were only able to do the first half of the game because of Yontif coming in. I might admit that when the Eagles scored their second touchdown, we were in the Amida, and I, maybe did one of these. It was all good, and I understand. I found out the next day, no one had to talk to me based on the, I would say, the affect of people as they came into synagogue on Monday. I understood what happened and then got the details after Yontif. What can I tell you? So it was a very Jewish Eagles moment, and may we have many more. I will say that I didn't know which kippah to wear today, because it is rare in my time at Adat Israel, in fact, almost non-existent in my time at Adat Israel, that there has been an overlap, a significant overlap between the time that I'm wearing my Eagles kippah and the time that I could still wear my Phillies kippah. So let that be our biggest problem. Let it be a hard decision for me each morning for approximately 3 more weeks. So something along those lines. All right, we're gonna get started. So let me just let this person in here. Good. Okay. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There were sadly, I would say, 2 controversies in the general press, that is to say, covered by the New York Times, but also others, that did not paint Jews in the best light, shall we say, over the last couple of weeks. There is a term for that we have in traditional Judaism called a chilul Hashem, which means a desecration of God's name, to the extent that our actions are supposed to be reflective to the broader world, and we assume that the broader world is watching. At least the New York Times was, certainly. To the extent that the broader world is watching, there's a premise in Judaism that says essentially that we do not want to desecrate the good name of God, and Judaism, that is what a chilul, or a desecration of God's name, is, by our actions and our representation. The classic example of this, the sort of 2 classic example of this, was Bernie Madoff and people saying, "Oy Nebuch, he's a Jew," right? Okay, and that's the type of thing that we don't want to happen. These 2 stories did not paint.
It's in your email.
Oh,
I put a red, it's yellow.
Hold on.
I highlighted it in yellow, at least on my copy.
Hold on, let me mute. Okay. That's now the first thing I need to say is, even within the Jewish community, the cross section that was portrayed publicly here is a minority, and even within Orthodoxy, it does not speak for all of Orthodoxy. However, between the 2 stories, it speaks to a much broader cross section of Orthodoxy, because it's 2 very different Orthodoxies that were represented in these 2 stories that came in sort of a very brief stretch of time. And so I'm going to share a screen here. I'm going to take I'm going to share some text with you, and hopefully we can, I trust you can all see. We good? Are you able to see now? Good. Okay. So the first thing is, let's look at the fact that I'm here in the sukkah as a metaphor for what this sort of tension with the view of the outside world is. Right. And the idea here is that the sukkah, like any society or any subset of society, is porous. The idea that there are strict and firm cloistered borders, even within ultra-orthodoxy, also known as Haredi, is simply false in today's world. And the existence of a New York Times article that was printed both in English and in Yiddish, a version, on yeshivish education. Even the word yeshivish shows how porous our world is. That's a sort of a combination of English and Yiddish. And so what I want us to see here is that the sukkah is a good metaphor for this, right? The idea of how open we are, how subject we are to the outside world. And the general principle of a sukkah is that our shade should be more than the sunlight that penetrates, meaning that sometimes it's not so great to air our dirty laundry taking our metaphor. And I think that given that these things were covered by the New York Times and others, one of the questions that I heard sort of bandied about is, would our reaction have been different had we exposed our own or spoken about our own? Had the Times of Israel or the Jewish Exponent or the Forward, or even in Yiddish, the Vorwärts, which is not even published in Yiddish anymore, I don't believe, would we have read these differently had it not been aired in the secular press? And I think that that's a sukkah question, right? Because the fact is that we didn't. To the extent that it stayed within and shaded, we didn't. And so that is a question in of itself. And there's another question, which is, to what extent is the people who are gathering here, are we inside or outside the sukkah? And that is a harder question, which I addressed in part on Yom Kippur afternoon on the high holidays, of how inside and outside do we view one another, right? And so that's our sort of working metaphor for being in the sukkah. Hold on for just 1 second, make sure everyone's in that needs to be in. Good. So with that in mind, let's go into the situations, and I'm going to give you some sort of, as I always do, Jewish talking points, and then I'm going to open it up to you periodically and hear your responses. So here we go. Okay. The first thing I think that we as non-Orthodox, most of us non-Orthodox Jews, I'm not assuming, but most of us here I know are non-Orthodox Jews, really important when you're outside the sukkah is to assume that not everyone inside the sukkah is the same. Do not assume that everyone is the same. Not all Orthodoxy is the same. And by and large, the people who would attend Yeshiva University and struggle with the story of a club for LGBTQ inclusion and how the university is sort of uncomfortably handling that. I'm going to give some high level details of both of these stories versus the yeshivot, where the education scores and the English literacy and basic math are so low that it really is embarrassingly low for a people who pride ourselves on education in general. These are two very different subsets of orthodoxy. So I'm going to give, and there are obviously salient details that I'm going to leave out here when I give these two stories for those of you who have not been following these stories. The first, Yeshiva University, is a university. It has multiple professional schools, highly esteemed, does, and this will be important when we get to it, does accept federal funding in a number of different arenas, research, other things, subject to a number of the title Roman numeral things, and has a club that students formed, a student club organization for LGBTQ inclusion. And this made Yeshiva University, given that Orthodoxy is not inclusive and does not recognize the full validity of people who are gay and lesbian and transgender, et cetera, under Jewish law, this sort of rubbed against the sort of two ways identity of Yeshiva University as a yeshiva and as a university. And there were a number of things that went back and forth. There was ultimately a court case that they should the advocates for the LGBTQ organization brought, I believe, under Title IX, but I may have the number wrong on that. And they basically said that they are, because the university accepts federal funds, they are subject to the expectation that there should be equal treatment. And there wasn't, and Yeshiva University went back and forth. At one point in time, Yeshiva University took the sort of nuclear approach of canceling all clubs in order to say we wouldn't endorse or embrace this one club. And because that seemed to be, as I said, the nuclear option, and also sort of punitive against many fellow students. And I think that my speculation is that the students were concerned that this would not help their cause, but would rather create enmity toward their cause. Their attorney offered a stay in the proceedings, which I believe has gone to the Supreme Court, stay in their proceedings, so that the other clubs could commence, and Yeshiva University accepted that stay, and so the other clubs are going to begin, I believe, after Sukkot. However, it does not solve the issue of inclusion, and there's a good number, a lot of conversation of, we of course care for our students regardless of their gender identity and sexual orientations and sexual identities, but there was not equal, getting room space and other benefits of being a recognized club. So that's the first story. The other story, happening within a couple of weeks, not, I think, less than 2 weeks of one another, was an expose in the New York Times. You can see the Yiddish version of it that already is a statement that the Times specifically presented a Yiddish version of this because the people that they were most sort of wanting to hear voiced, the whole point of it was that the scores in ultra-Orthodox yeshivot for basic skills and assessments in New York State were abysmal. And they had, I mean, it was really self-evident. I mean, they had, the way that kids in like 9th and 10th grade were writing looked like, what my kids were writing in, 5 years old, really, and the amount of attention given to that, those studies, and the way in which the studies were executed, in some ways, including some pretty aggressive tactics by teachers, and things like that, were as we say in Yiddish, a shanda. So those are the two stories. There were a lot of different conversations about these stories. A lot of embarrassment, and people acted out their embarrassment in different ways. People being defensive of the ultra-Orthodox yeshivot say, well, the New York Times doesn't tell the story about all the anti-Semitism that's happening in those very neighborhoods. What authority or validity do they have to be the voice of what's wrong with us when they're not talking about what other people are doing to us? And there is a part of me that feels like, I wish this would have come out in the Times of Israel before it came out in the New York Times. But the fact is that it didn't, right? Anyway, so that's the first thing I wanted to share. Now we're going to move on to some general Jewish texts, and then I'm going to pause for a second. So that people can talk. So I just want to give you these because we can talk about this just from our own personal experience or emotion, but the purpose of this session is to talk about it in the lens of through the lens of Jewish text and tradition. And so I'm going to give you a couple of quick texts, and then one historical text, and I'm going to go very quickly through them. And if you want to see them or ask me to scroll back to one, if you're going to refer to it, happy to do so. So we've looked at this text before. This is the text that the sage Shmuel taught, I believe in the 4th century, maybe in the early 5th century, that says Dina de Malchuta Dina, that the law of the governing authority, meaning that it's presumably the non-Jewish governing authority, is actually, it is Jewish law to follow the laws of the place and where Jews live. right? That's what dina de malchuta dina. Din means law. The law of the kingdom is our law, is what does it mean? The problem of that is that when you have blurriness on that, the question is, where does one authority end and the next begin? What is the malchuta and what is the Jewish law? The purpose of Shmuel here was to make this blurry, right? Is to say it's Jewish law to follow the king's law, right, or the governing law. But then the question is, where does one end and the next begin? And there's a lot of pros and cons to this, right? And so when we're talking about educational institutions, both Yeshiva University and the Yeshivot, there are some real questions here. To what extent are these educational institutions societal public arenas? Meaning, like, Yeshiva University is a university. It is an open marketplace of ideas. And the idea of a university is to not be specifically ideological, but to welcome even challenging, even ideas that are anathema to how we feel as in all of our ideological subsets, whether it be as Americans or as Jews or anyone else with any other. The idea is to feel challenged and to have a respectful, not dangerous, but open debate on that. And the way that is said, this is very much out of context, is Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. If you can see my pointer, oh, didn't mean to do that. Let's go back up. Where my pointer is right now is, I lost it. There we go. This is this phrase, both are valid words of the living God, right? And if you are those things, then the way our society is structured, that there are government-supported services that come from that come with that, right? Whether that's research grants, whether that's other sorts of funding, whether that's tax exempt, whatever it may be, right? Though religious institutions also get tax exempt status. But then on the other side, and this is definitely more clearly true of the quandary for Yeshiva University, though I think when you talk about educational institutions, we also support educational institutions that are private schools. To what extent are these purely religious institutions? And if they are purely religious institutions, they are protected under the First Amendment for their, you can't make Adith Israel, have a cross, even in a place where, or an era in which the Supreme Court would have certain iconography. You can't say we are a purely religious institution. We are ideologically driven. We are ideologically sustained. And what that means is I am within reason and obviously within the taste and temperament of the people who hire me, I am able to set an ideology that may or may not be in keeping with the governing, or even majority principles right now. Now, I have to be politically savvy about that. I have to be sensitive to a nurturing debate, and those things are just what you do because we are menschlich. But if someone said to me, we think that truly American organizations will express their Americanism by having hat-filled hot dogs washed down by milk at Kiddush or whatever your post-service, post-ritual repast is, then I am exempt from that. I do not have to do that if someone said that. So that's on the other side. And specifically when it comes to schools and the yeshivas in Borough Park and elsewhere is these are not, our society does not set it up that these are fully independent organizations, because historically, certainly schools, but even houses of worship have been mechanisms to deliver critical societal support. So for example, there is a Lower Merion nurse that comes to Perlman Jewish Day School to administer health screenings, state-mandated health screenings for the Jewish students at Perlman Jewish Day School. And the day school is seen as a partner in that and sets that up and schedules it in a way that makes sense in their schedule, but is mandated for it because it is deemed critical support. There are pros and cons of being either one, being a purely religious institution versus an open marketplace of ideas, having to do with funding and things like that. But it's very hard to, have your kichel and eat it too, as it were. Now, a couple of background texts, and then I'm going to pause. So the first thing is this idea of learning Greek and external influence. There's a real debate in the Talmud as to whether it's okay to learn Greek, and Greek being like secular studies. It's been a metaphor for all of secular studies, but at the time, especially for the early rabbis, it was Greek and Latin, but mostly they were talking about studying Greek wisdom, Greek philosophers. We're talking the era of Plato, Socrates, and things like that, right? Okay, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the era of the rabbis, and you can see the ambivalence of that by this. This is one excerpt of a much longer debate. There's a whole debate as to are there certain prayers that can be said in the colloquial language. Can you, for example, say the Amida in French or English, right? And does that quote unquote count for the Amida? And there's certain prayers you can and certain prayers you can't. There's a lot of debate as to how much we should let this go in. By the way, these debates extended and continue in some places to extend, but even into the 19th century, the idea in early Reform Judaism in the late 19th century, does the rabbi give the sermon in Yiddish, or does the rabbi give the sermon in German, right? Was a massive, massive conversation speaking to how German and how Jewish we are. So here is that idea as well. Rabbi Ishmael says, and by the way, a lot of rabbis knew Greek, so they were kind of in a bind here because they wanted people to focus on their Torah studies, but Greek was where it was at, right? And so they say the following. They say there is there's a verse that says lo yamush mipicha v'agita bo yomam v'layla. You should engage in it day and night. Okay, and so Rabbi Ishmael says, okay, fine. If the Torah tells you you should engage in Torah day and night, where does that leave for any secular studies? And the answer is, well, there's this very short period of time that's literally called Bein Hashmashot, which means between the two suns. In ancient times, they thought that the moon was a source of light, right? Okay, so like basically it's no longer daytime and it's not yet nighttime. So we would be talking in last night, that would have been, well, it was Yontif, but like in this time of year, that would have been basically from 6:13 or 6:14 until about 6:48. We would have given about 37 minutes-ish in there, where you could have done, and you could have done the same amount in the morning, right? Where you could have done secular studies. Everything else is you're supposed to be engaged in Torah study, right? And now, I know that I'm doing this a little tongue-in-cheek. I think Rabbi Ishmael is doing it a little tongue-in-cheek. But if you take this seriously, what does that mean for the amount of priority that you're giving to math and English? And the reason for this is very simple. If you can't talk to him, and you can't eat with him, you can't marry him. That was it. All this could lead to mixed dancing, right? Okay, that's the joke, right? It was really, you can't, and if you can't marry him, you can't worship like him. And if you can't worship like him, you're not likely to socialize with him because you're not eating with him and you're not talking with him and you're not doing anything. And that keeps us, I'm not advocating for it, but it is a very effective thing for self-sustaining a small minority community to stay cloistered. It works. That doesn't mean it's good. And by the way, the rabbis learned Greek. That's part of the issue here. I said, remember Acher. Acher was a rabbi who was ultimately an incredibly significant sage in the early Mishnah, who was, his name was Rabbi Alisha Benaboya. In this, we've learned about him in the past. I happen to, because he sort of dances on the border between the secular and the religious, I think he's a really interesting character. But Rabbi Alisha Benaboya, whose name became Acher, or mean the other one, or the outsider, one of the things that is said of Acher was that, and by the way, some of you are guilty of this too, or at least your kids are. He was once in shul, and he was supposed to be davening what became the Amida. It wasn't yet the Amida. And he stood up, and a book of Greek philosophy fell out of inside of his siddur, essentially, right? That he was reading that instead. And this was not the reason that he was excommunicated, but he eventually was excommunicated. And after that, they said, oh, that guy wasn't worth a hill of beans anyway. Don't you remember that time when he was sneaking Greek philosophy into shul? By the way, years and years and years ago, I once worked with a cantor who did the same thing during the sermon. He would pretend to be studying something for his next davening, but was actually reading a book, which I found to be both humorous and, problematic by Talmudic standards. That's a true story. Okay, so I want to pause for just 1 second. Before we get to Napoleon. That's a sentence I've never said. Before we get to Napoleon. Okay. Before we get to Napoleon, I want to pause because what you're seeing here is a tension between the very effective way of Jewish continuity of cloistering. And by the way, I should say there are always the New York Times expose in the yeshiva world focused a lot on the people who felt ostracized, who weren't good at Talmud, who had been subject to capital punishment in their classes, who had asked a non-doctrinal question and had been ostracized and had left Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy and taken to drugs, and it was really they were talking about these sad cases. But by and large, it's very effective to be cloistered because mostly people turn in because the societal risk of not turning in is pretty absolute. It's kind of, well, it's excommunication. So this is the debate and the challenges. Who's in, who's out? How do we navigate that? And when we're trying to navigate that, where are those boundaries between individual autonomy first, sort of a Kantian individual autonomy, then sort of the family or clan unit, then the community, that's the next sort of boundaries out, and then beyond that, the societal broader, as we called it, the malchuta, the broader societal expectations. So and especially in cloistered communities and in very highly orthodox with a small o, dogmatic approaches within families, this really, it can chafe for people. So this is what I think is ultimately the issue in these questions and why they're so interesting to us as outsiders to it. Like you're always kind of curious what's in someone else's sukkah, right? That's why sukkah hops are so popular. I want to see that person. I want to see what I drove by that person's sukkah. It looks nice. I'd like to go in that person's sukkah, right? And you have that feeling of like, I wonder. And by the way, it's not just Sukkot, right? How many of you have gone on Zillow and you're not really in the market because you're like, oh yeah, there's that house. That house looks crazy on the outside. I want to know what's on the inside. By the way, if you're curious about that, my parents have a house in Margate on Haverford Avenue. They are 4 blocks back. But if you've ever been 2 blocks back on Haverford Avenue, there's the guy with the crazy house that's like blue and silver and has like mannequins all out. If you've been in Margate, you know. And there's a YouTube video where you can look at the inside of that guy's house, and you want to. You want to see the inside of that guy's house. He has like Obama and Trump, mannequins like arm in arm across one another. Like, I mean, it's crazy. And that's the outside. And you're wondering what's on the inside, right? So part of it is a little bit of, I use this word, loosely, but I think it's true, of sort of, voyeurism, right? Of I wonder what's in there. Right. So we are guilty of that. But also, in some extent, to the fact that we are all Jews, there's also a, there's like a, is this speaking for us, right? What kind of neon light are we to the nations, unto the nations, if we are right now? So I want to pause for a second, get any responses through the Jewish lens that we have right now, and then we're going to go into the last couple of texts, which really are mostly Napoleon. So anyone want to say something? Anyone want to sort of reflect on through these Jewish lens of how inside we are, how outside we are, what the articles made you feel when you saw them? Both of these, by the way, are unresolved issues. There's a stay in the Yeshiva University one. That's it. Anyone?
Well, I'd like to say one thing that I when I think about the not the Yeshiva University one, but the other story, I think about, okay, just as you described, so can we be cloistered? You know, there's Amish, there's in some ways Iran, there's China in some ways, and that's the idea is we're going to have our own universe within whatever else is happening, but we're just going to have our own universe. But what I wondered from that article or that issue is whether it's the U.S. saying we, as a fundamental baseline standard, believe that every human being that's a part of our country has to have a certain baseline of education, and therefore that has to apply regardless of whether you're in a cloistered community or not. You can have your cloistering up to a point, but you also then need to get education. You need to get the baseline sort of US standard education.
Yep. And that's where it gets tricky, where we set an umbrella standard that cuts across all cloistering. And some of those things, by the way, may be health standards, right? When it comes to education, I think the general sense is we want people to have the skills by which they will not just be a burden on society, but they will not be endangered to themselves, right? And these are well intentioned, but if you ask someone within the cloister, they will say these are impositions, right? That it's an imposition on my freedom of expression of religion, right? Because my freedom of expression of religion says, and they will point you to Rabbi Ishmael and says that I can allocate, 6% of my daily learning to anything outside of Torah. And that's the way I understand that. And who are you, government, big bad government, to say anything else? By the way, Israel is not immune to this, even as a Jewish state, right? Where there's an incredible amount in the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world, of distrust against the Israeli government for all sorts of things. Early on, that was a major source of issues, by the way, also with Israel's model vaccination efforts, in part because socialized medicine makes that easier. The huge exception to that was a cross-section that was convinced that the vaccine would cause infertility, and then they would, and obviously fertility is a huge societal value. Among the first mitzvot, be fruitful and multiply, right? You are, and I know that that's not the way we as sort of Jews with dancing at both weddings, right? A foot in both worlds think. However, if you are in that mindset where Torah is absolute, where be fruitful and multiply is the ultimate blessing and the ultimate commandment, if that is the mindset in which you operate, and some non-rabbinic secular authority says it's not just, when Shmuel said Dina de Malchuta Dina, Shmuel did not, that the law of the governing authority is incumbent upon us as Jews. Shmuel did not mean that if the governing authority said thou shalt break Shabbos, right? Shmuel meant that like you should pay your taxes, right?
Well, and I think too, your point about health care is a really important contrast too, because we have said in this country that health standards do get religious exemptions or exceptions. And so, or at least we debate that quite often. So if that's the case, then why would we be saying, but the education standard has to, you have to meet the education standard, but you don't have to meet the healthcare standard.
Right. It's if anything, it seems upside down. Especially because happiness quotients seem to be very high in these communities. They by and large, now they're a bit, the the polls are a bit skewed because they don't really poll the people they excommunicated. That's a general principle, right? You don't usually poll the people you excommunicate, but especially in a cloister community. Nancy, I see that you have a hand up.
Yes, a few things.
Mhm.
I think when you get to certain health issues, like the fact that the outbreak of polio or the outbreak of measles seem to be centered in good part, not totally, in some of the more Haredi communities, and then it spreads to the rest of the population. There's a line that's crossed right there. But my other point really goes to having your cake and eat it too. I believe that both the yeshivas, well, I know that Yeshiva University, and I believe that the article said that the schools also receive government monies. And if I am such a firm believer in the separation of church and state, for constitutional reasons, but also because I really believe that that separation protects minority religions, protects us, not defeats us. So that, and with this Supreme Court now deciding that opinion, people are going to applaud and say, oh, it's so great. Yeshiva University doesn't have to, have this club. Perhaps that will be their decision. I believe that ultimately it will backfire because as more and more other religions get to do more and more in the public marketplace, it is Jews and other minorities that will be sorely hurt.
So that's the cake and eat it too thing, right? I mean, the yeshivot actually receive an incredible disproportionate amount of public support. And on the one hand, these are tax-paying people who, sometimes I have heard it said, well, they receive a disproportionate amount of specific services, special education. They receive a disproportionate amount of transportation, definitely transportation vouchers and things like that. However, they're not using teacher salaries, and they're not using, and so that's one justification for it. I'm not saying the right and wrong of it, but I'm saying that you will hear that counter argument. However, the question is, and this is where it's very blurry, is if it is a societal value to get kids to school, and you believe that and parents, for whatever their work or their own disabilities and things like that, can't get their kids reliably to school without public transportation or busing or whatever it is, and you don't believe that you can govern which school they can get to, I'm playing a devil's advocate here, right? Then transportation vouchers or transportation logistics that get kids to a private school, a yeshiva, a Catholic school, anything, a parochial school, it makes sense in the same way that health screenings make sense. If that is the way our society has prioritized things. However, these things, a couple years, more than a couple years ago now, I think it's almost 10 years ago now, the Ramapo district in just north of New York City, where the ultra-Orthodox community, this is like where the Catskills yeshivot all are. They got their people on the school board, and they started to vote against things like arts education and physical education in the public schools because they weren't using the public schools, and they wanted to. They passed a budget that clearly skewed money to the yeshivot, right? And so that was clearly an abuse of power, and it was a real challenge because the non-Orthodox synagogues were actually speaking out publicly against their ultra-Orthodox neighbors, and it was a real schism within the Jewish community because they were diverting funds. So look, these things get complicated. Is it equal funds for transportation? Whether you're going to a public school or a private school, equal funds for special education. I don't know how to, each one of these things is different. And by the way, they're case by case. So I can't give a blanket, but there's no question that decision of to what extent are you a public institution, even if you're a private institution that is executing a public need, like health screenings for for kids in private schools, things like that. You are the context or the location of a greater public need, having a government-sponsored vaccination clinic at a private school, for example, or even at a synagogue, using our synagogue as a polling place, that sort of thing made people uncomfortable. I must say, there were logistical reasons why it couldn't be done, because of when they wanted to do it. I think it was on a Yontif at one point in time, there's, I can't remember exactly. I think we had an issue with Pesach at one year, but we used to be a polling place. These are things that we live in this tension, right? I want to share with you the Napoleon text, mostly because it's such an interesting text that shows, like, as Napoleon would say, plus ça change, right? The more things change, right? So here, let's pull this one up. I don't think that's exactly what Napoleon would say, but anyway, so this is something that Napoleon did, and it's really something that only someone as Napoleonic as Napoleon could do, right? Is he convinced the Jews in Paris to convene a Sanhedrin. A Sanhedrin is a Jewish court. However, as this Sanhedrin points out, the last Sanhedrin that was convened was in Temple times, but they convened 71 elders, constituting themselves, and you can read it as I go, but I'm going to paraphrase it, as the Grand Sanhedrin, to create new understandings of law or continued understandings. And the goal of this Sanhedrin, at the outset, this was all pretextual, because the goal of this Sanhedrin absolutely was to convince Napoleon to emancipate the Jews, that is to say, to make the Jews full Frenchmen, right? That was the goal. And they had to answer there was a Count Molay, who issued a whole series of questions, some of them about marrying between Catholics and Jews, some of them between how would you serve in the French army if need be, given that the rations are often dried pork products, like all sorts of like tons of questions that they had to answer to essentially prove their Frenchiness, I guess. I don't know. Okay. And so this is the way the Sanhedrin did this. And I want you to read in this how different this was than the cloistering, because of how much they wanted to decloister the Jewish community. And by the way, the Jewish community was cloistered not by their own choice in many cases, in some cases, yes, but really by French law, right? It was an outward pressure that had cloistered us, right? Okay, and this is the second paragraph, right? So first thing they do is they declare their authority to do this, which is, there's a French word for this. I believe the French word is chutzpah. Okay, the second paragraph is where it says that the precious heritage of our ancestors, the law that they are that they are bound to, actually is two sets of laws. One set are religious, and that those are timeless, and that no government can take those away from us. And then the others are, here's the word right here, political dispositions, right? So there are two categories of law. By the way, it's not without precedent, but the way that they are using it is clearly they are falling over themselves to show how loyal they could be as Frenchmen, right? Okay. There are religious dispositions, and no one's going to mess with those. There are political dispositions that arose in a context. By the way, a lot of this makes sense to me as a conservative Jew, right? These political dispositions arose in the context of the people living in what the Romans had termed Palestine, the people of Israel and Palestine, when it had lost it. When why is it not going? When the people of Israel had our own kings, it was called Palestine by the Romans at that point in time, and the French are sort of descendants of that word. That word in and of itself is a choice word to use the geographical Roman designated term of that piece of land. And it says, since Israel no longer forms a nation, meaning like a nation, when they're talking about nation, they're talking about peoplehood there. In the way that we use nation, they're talking about like France, right? Borders and things like that. Israel doesn't have borders at the time. We're talking, this was in 1807. Okay, in having that distinction that has already been established by tradition, that this typo that this body that we have convened for the first time in 1737 years is the one that's going to determine the distinction between political and religious laws. And this is a very unique moment where we need to convene a Sanhedrin, which we have not done for 1737 years. Okay, and therefore we are going to do that, and it is divinely ordained. The divine light, they say, by the way, which is, it's a secular term for God. It's like what the secular Israelis use, like David Ben-Gurion. It was in the Declaration of the State of Israel. They used our rock, the rock of Israel, because the secular Israelis didn't want to use the word God, and the religious chalutzim in 1948 wanted to only use God as the divine rationale for having, and so they used the word our rock. So what do the Sanhedrin do? They use the divine light, right? That gives us this idea to legislate according to the needs of the situation and impose upon Israel the observance of laws, meaning namely the political laws, that force us to be obedient to the state, meaning France. By the way, this statement that the political laws have changed our context, but the religious laws are timeless. You know what this is, right? It is conservative Judaism, right? But they were all Orthodox Jews, or they were just at that time just called, Jews. But that's what they're doing, and they are saying, based on the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, they're saying Moses got this stuff from Sinai, passed it down generation to generation. We now have received it, and we are going to interpret it as the moment requires, as the moment demands, and that moment says that we're going to split all halacha into two. Political goes to Napoleon, religious goes to us. Napoleon, can you handle that? If you want to handle that, we pledge our loyalty. We are now French. The way that they had to split hairs to do that, and the dance that they did, and I hope you can see the discomfort in the dance, is exactly the discomfort we feel when we say, well, how yeshivish are the yeshivas, and how much are they schools? And how much is it a yeshiva, and how much is it a university? And where can we do one? And by the way, which benefits us more, and which hurts us more? And when we are being critiqued by an outside, let's say media, in this case, public opinion, it doesn't look so good, right? Right? Because I would imagine that when this Sanhedrin put out this statement, and this is only part of the statement, they go into all the details of all the answers of all the hard questions. I would imagine there were people within Judaism who said, where do they get off doing this? There hasn't been a Sanhedrin since, Rabban Gamliel. And now look who thinks he's a Sanhedrin, right? Look who thinks he's a Sanhedrin now all of a sudden, right? And within Judaism, there were people who said, they can't do this. They're ruining Judaism. And there were plenty of French people, citizens of the French Republic, or Napoleon's Republic, that said, these are Jews. They will never be Frenchmen. And the debate on the inside was, how much are we Jewish and how much are we French? How much are we yeshiva and how much are we university? How much are we an educational delivery system, and how much are we a religious organization that delivers Torah only? These are the same discomforts, There are more discomforts. Okay, we're not going to have time for this one, but I will say, you can see up top here, one of the discomforts is what we started with, this Chilul Hashem, which we also call Ashanda, right? Okay, having these articles in the New York Times overall is not comfortable. What's below here is a question of what's in and what's out. It's a much more complicated model. It's sort of visually shown here that there's a norm, there's pluralism. Okay, well, you can learn a little bit of Greek, right? There's tolerance, like you're kind of not following, you're kind of more Greek than you are Jewish, but you can still have an Aliyah. Then there's tolerable deviance, which is like you're not so, and then there's intolerable deviance, which is essentially cherem. It's essentially excommunication. But the issue that we end up having is where these boundaries are and how they navigate, or how we navigate them, I guess is the best way of saying it. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to take about 4 minutes of comments here. Then we're going to do one last thing that I hope everyone can stay for, which is I'm going to put something in the chat that's a very quick survey will help Len and myself chart a future. But anyone may want to make a comment while I'm doing that survey thing. If someone wants to say anything, just shout out. Any thoughts? This is the challenge, right?
Well,
There we go. This is the challenge. The challenge is, where do we sit and how porous are our boundaries? Yeshiva University is sitting on the cusp of that because they want to have fidelity to their religious beliefs. Whether we like those beliefs or not is irrelevant. Those are their religious beliefs. And then we have but they also receive federal funds. Here's what I'm doing now. I'm just going to do this very quickly, because I know that people are going to have to go right at 1:30. I'm putting a link into a 1-question Google survey. Please fill it out. This is about whether people would come in person if we here, I'm going to share the screen so you can see the question. Here it is. Here's the question. If Lunch and Learn went back to in person, but was hybrid, because that's most likely what we're going to do, what would you do? Would you stay on Zoom most months, attend most months in person? And if in person, we have found out that we could bring back most likely CLE credit, but CLE right now is not set up for the type of thing that we do for virtual, for hybrid, because you need that software that makes you click on every couple of minutes to make sure you're still paying attention and you're not checking email. I don't care if you're checking email, but evidently the CLE board does. You can see the other options there. This is the only question on there other than your name, which is optional. So please do fill it out. Will help Len and will help me figure out the path forward and how quickly we should go to that path. So that is that. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes if anyone has any other questions or comments, but I want to thank you all for learning.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do we get back to the what you just had up and enter it and answer the question after the lesson is over? Is that being circulated by email to everybody?
What's the question? Yeah, Len, we can send that out. And Karen, I just want to say how great it is to see you from afar. We miss you. And I'm glad.
Likewise.
I'm glad you are here and are able to be here. And for this foreseeable future, we are likely to have a virtual option. So please don't be a stranger. Yeah, Len, we can send out I'll send you the link and we'll send this out as a follow-up. Sure. But I promise you, it's a 30-second survey. Just do it while you're here. Just click. It's the best way to get it done. And I know there are people from afar and people who are not going out as much. So we want to be sensitive to everyone's kind of different considerations. So thank you all. Hello from everywhere here. My goodness, from afar, from very far. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and have a good Sukkot. Take care. Bye.